both Oppenheimer and The Zone of Interest may win multiple awards. And again, what we are seeing is a certain fascination with the Second World War. In both of these cases, they're not conventional war movies by any stretch of the imagination, but to a degree, and certainly within the American psyche, the Americans do view the Second World War as the good war. There was a clear cause. It was unambiguous to end fascism in Europe and East Asia. Now, just to think about other very prominent films that have come up and been subject to multiple awards. I think it's worth looking at Christopher Nolan's other major Second World War movie, Dunkirk, where Oppenheimer is very much a film about one person, but with a vast and highly talented collective cast, which do, an absolutely phenomenal job of dealing with the complexity of Oppenheimer's achievement in the Manhattan Project and the complexity of his life. We are seeing something which is very much backstage to the war itself. It is actually very telling in Oppenheimer that you don't see the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Oppenheimer wasn't there. It was not directly part of his story, although it came to dominate the latter part of his life. Okay. The contrast with this is Dunkirk, and Dunkirk is a miraculous film. Three intertwined stories dealing with the land, the sea, and the air. Dunkirk, in its own right, was a successful film dealing with three aspects of war: the sea, the air, and the land. It won 3 Academy Awards: Best Film Editing, Best Sound Editing, and Best Sound Mixing. And the 3 stories interleave. They're very much about the individual. Tom Hardy's pilot, the story of the boats coming across to rescue the British troops trying to leave Dunkirk, and the chaos and the fear of trying to get off the beaches. Okay. It's again another massive ensemble piece, but it does show how the stories intertwine. And in many respects, Dunkirk represents, Britain at its best. In defeat, we managed to create a miracle. And there is quite a strong line in some academic authors that ultimately 1940 and 1941, when Britain and its empire of 700 million people, but Britain largely stood alone in Europe, kept Western society, Western democracy going. And Dunkirk sort of typifies that attitude and that effort. Virtually all of the investment in armored equipment had to be dispensed with at that point in time, but you start seeing the need to bring the troops back, to bring them back safely, and the way it was achieved was an unbelievable effort by everyone involved. And the film shows this remarkably well. At the time, there was a degree of controversy at not showing colonial troops as part of the evacuation from Dunkirk. And in that, most people talked about British colonial troops, and particularly Sikhs and others from the British Empire. Yeah. And I think that was a little bit of a distraction to a certain degree for 2 reasons. In terms of representativeness, yes, I think Christopher Nolan could have made more of an effort in that regard, but it was not intended to be a comprehensive story of the evacuation. It was three fine vignettes welded together over the better part of 3 hours. But the second point is there were colonial troops there. The fact they were French colonial troops, that they were part of the French Empire from Africa, went completely uncommented on in that controversy. So I think it's a point you need to consider. We want representativeness. We want to make sure that history shows all of the sections of society that were involved in major conflicts. I think in this case, perhaps we will forgive Christopher Nolan for overlooking that particular issue. It would have been good if it had been included. So if you want to start looking at past highly decorated Second World War movies, I would start with Dunkirk. And the reason being, it is a story of determination in adversity, with much tragedy as well as some success. And I think that's really worth considering. And it may well be that with Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan achieves far more. It is, I think, 11 nominations this time round, and has been cleaning up quite a lot in the other award ceremonies. If you want to think of another Second World War movie that again was highly decorated in terms of the Oscars and other awards, but actually has great value in itself as a piece of work, I would go to Steven Spielberg's 1993 Schindler's List. It gives you a different aspect of the Second World War. It is taking you into the same territory as the zone of interest, although there is clearly a story and a humanitization of all of the characters there, for good or evil. Whereas the zone of interest, which is an absolutely outstanding movie, is both quite harrowing and challenging in places. Oscar Schindler was well known amongst Jewish communities before this film. Thomas Keneally's book, Schindler's Ark, became the basis of Schindler's List. And it is a story of individualism in another respect, defying a dictatorship, an all-pervasive police state with fascism at the heart of it, and showing how one man potentially can make a difference for hundreds, if not thousands of others. It's also quite marked that Steven Spielberg's view of the Second World War is steeped in black and white contemporary footage. And I think that's worth viewing again for the very intelligent and subtle use of color, some of which will leave people in tears during that film. It's worth reviewing again. It's worth watching again, because the strength of a story which actually predominantly happened. It shows history that it shows history of a period that even when challenged by forces of darkness, one or two people can illuminate a very bleak landscape. Now, if we follow this through, Spielberg's view of the Second World War is carried forward again with Saving Private Ryan. And it was another multiple Academy Award winning film. Best director, best cinematography, best editing, best sound, best sound effects editing, with many other nominations as well. Now, more than anything, it is the first part of the film that is the most devastating. If Dunkirk was about an inglorious retreat, then Saving Private Ryan and the D-Day landings, and we are now 80 years from that particular event, we are seeing a traumatic hellscape putting American soldiers on the Normandy beach. And I think more than anything, veterans who experienced the carnage came away saying that is as near as they have seen in a cinematic representation of the experience that they had to endure. Now, the story thereafter is about camaraderie and support. It's not necessarily the film I would immediately go to, as opposed to Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, because it becomes a more traditional war film thereafter. And while there is great merit in the telling of the tales of battle and heroism, it is those films which are distinctly different that gives us a better insight as we move forward in the 21st century. If you want to look at another highly lauded film, and one which I really do think is worth considering, is Clint Eastwood's Letters from Iwo Jima. Moving away from the home front, which is one way of thinking about Oppenheimer, and moving away from Europe, Letters from Iwo Jima is a quite remarkable film. It won 1 Oscar. It was nominated for both Best Picture and Best Director, plus Best Original Screenplay. And the reason that it is really quite a remarkable film is that it is virtually completely in Japanese, a language which Clint Eastwood does not speak to any great degree. He became interested in the Battle of Iwo Jima while preparing his film Flags of Our Fathers. Flags of Our Fathers is definitely worth reviewing. It deals with one of the more iconic moments in American history, the flag raising in Iwo Jima in 1945. And it is worth watching the two films back to back. So it is worth watching Flags of Our Fathers first, and then Letters of Iwo Jima. The two films give both sides of the assault on Sulphur Island. That is what Iwo Jima stands for. And it's not easily understood why the Japanese fought to the degree they did. Something like 20% only of the Japanese forces survived. And one of the reasons is, although this is an island hundreds of miles away from the Japanese mainland, it is part of the imperial prefecture, which is covered by Tokyo. So for the Japanese, this was the beginning of the last pitched battles. Every inch of imperial land will be fought for. And what happened was that the more that Clint Eastwood made Flags of Our Fathers, the more he became interested in what was happening on the Japanese side. So we have a remarkable piece of work which does follow through the Japanese story, and the back-to-back viewing. There are parts from one film that pay off in the other. Okay, they can be watched individually. Flags of Our Fathers has great merit. It's perhaps not the greatest war film, but as part of a 4-hour study, the two films together, about what the nature of war actually is, it is sobering to see the two films, one from the American side, when the photograph that was taken of the flag raising became an iconic, um, gained an iconic status in its own right to raise funds towards the end of the war. And the men who conducted the flag raising suddenly find themselves in a fish out of water situation, well away from the fighting, and as propagandists from the Americans. From Letters from Iwo Jima, it intelligently deals with the Japanese commitment to the empire and to fight to the very end. Although there are some bizarre scenes where some of the Japanese soldiers feel that they have betrayed their commitment to the empire and commit suicide with hand grenades. It's very, very odd, although actually correct. It gives you an idea of how committed the Japanese were to honoring what goes on. Ken Wannabe's performance is fabulous. And if you can tolerate 2 hours of a film in a foreign language, I would strongly recommend watching Letters from Iwo Jima. So with regards to Dunkirk, Schindler's List, and Letters from Iwo Jima, if you want to consider some other critically acclaimed and extremely well-made films as we run up to the Oscar ceremonies, you can watch these with confidence.